with its own, grassroots work, the basis for then the assessment happening in a more efficient way. So I'll keep it at that, and I'll let people discuss.
Thank you very much, Claudia.
So very much in light of what Claudia has just been saying, so just to remind you the objectives of the discussion and so the session. So first of all, ideas and recommendations for how scenarios can be further used to strengthen coordination across the IPCC. And then shortcomings in the current scenarios framework and the literature that hinders wider use in the assessment by the IPCC. And any gaps in the scenario literature and challenges in the context of IPCC assessment, so remembering the audience expectations and wishes, and in that light as well, recommendations for future research, so I think that's happening a lot in the parallel sessions. So now if anyone would like to start from the audience, and then we'll go to the panelists after a few questions.
I see several hands. We start in the back there. Stefan, I think that was your name. And we need a microphone. This is not streamed, so it's mainly for internal.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But I can use my voice then. I can use this. Okay. I'm Stefan Lindberg, professor and director at the Wiedem Institute, University of Gothenburg. This is directed to all. It's an open question, but maybe mostly to Stephen. In terms of the challenges and limitations for the AR7, and I should full disclosure, I'm still trying to understand everything you do. So it may be a stupid question, and then tell me it's stupid. It's taking the splash, and this may be a sort of a thought. Okay, so I'm thinking about several recent articles, literature in nature, climate change, and in European environmental research letters, a series of articles showing that democracies perform much better than autocracies on the Paris Accord. And the one I'm referring to is a difference in 1.6 degrees. And also with implementation on CO2 emissions and so on. And we have very strong theories in political science why that should be the case, with public pressure and institutions providing that upwards and so on. I realize it may be a kiss of death in the IPCC context, but I wanted to hear your thoughts, because our research then document all this with the third wave of autocratization. We are in a steep decline. We've lost 32 democracies in the last 20 years. I can give you a scenario. We are right now with 70% of the population in the world live in autocracies. I can give you a very credible scenario for the next 20 years, and we're 90% of population, and we lose that pressure. Is this a challenge that should be there and incorporated here? That's the question.
Thank you. We take 3 questions, and then in the meantime, you can prepare your responses here in the panel. I saw a hand down. Can you send the microphone to the gentleman there? And then after that, it's Jim.
Thank you very much. Shin Asayama from National Institute for Environment Studies. I'm just wondering about for facilitating working group collaborations. In this cycle, as my sense is XR15 is a very good example for these activities. And then I was just wondering about, there is now floating ideas of new topics for special reports. And one of the issues perhaps maybe like an overshoot can be like interesting topic to look into the cross working group collaboration. So I don't know whether you think there should be like an IPCC special report on overshoot using like overshoot scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question is Jim Ski, and you can come to this microphone to the quick here.
Okay, thank you. Give me a false sense of authority here. Yeah. Okay. I mean, just to say, when you're asked the question by a government, what's the difference between climate resilient development pathways and shifting pathways towards sustainability, the correct answer is Hans Portner knows the answer to that one, but I don't see him in the room. What my question was actually about was nomenclature and communication with other people, which was sparked off by one of K1's slides. I think earlier in this cycle we had the idea that we could have, 5 marker scenarios that helped us to link across the 3 working groups, and these were essentially done by dipping into the RCP SSP matrix. So just a kind of a provocation there. Suppose instead of doing that, you actually aligned the markers with the global warming levels that were used by working group 2, so you could get a better communication across the 3 working groups. And then perhaps if working group 3 were binning scenarios, instead of using the global warming levels to provide the bounds for the bins, could you actually use them to provide the centre of the bins so that you could get a better kind of alignment there? And my other question related to this is, could we tell stories around the markers to make them more intelligible to governments? We saw it happened in the Working Group 1 approval when they were all SSP 5, 8.5. The governments threw it out and said we'll just have very low, medium, high, very high. But can you actually tell a story behind the markers, which comes from Working Group 3 in a way, because we've picked on things like current policies, pledges, Paris targets? Could you align the markers with these kind of things, to kind of join it up? And just to say, I would love to see a high-end scenario analogous to the SSP 5 8.5 that was actually internally coherent. It's the right answer for Working Group 2 for the wrong reasons, because it's got an implausible set of emission scenarios on a central climate sensitivity. And basically, I think this is where you could start to tell stories about low likelihood, high impact things on the climate side. So just a few thoughts on markers and maybe whether being able to join it up across all 3 working groups.
Thank you, Jim. And then I will ask Steve to respond to the first question about democracy and so on. Please, Steve.
I like how I got handed the mic first. Is it on? Yes. I'll try to offer some quick thoughts and then pass it down the line. With respect to your first question regarding democracies versus autocracies, I think it's a great point, right? We need to be thinking about how governments operate. We're not necessarily trying to model them endogenously in terms of how they might respond to climate, for example, but I do think we need to be thinking about different dynamics in terms of decision making and what it might imply in terms of being able to address climate change. So I think that's just one example of trying to get more realistic in thinking about what are our opportunities and constraints for moving forward. So a quick reaction there. Also a great suggestion in terms of thinking about the 1.5 special report as an illustration of integration real time, right? Because you have all the working groups working together. I guess that's a good question about whether maybe we should be looking for more opportunities, and overshoot would certainly be a good topic for it. And it does sort of help address some of these issues in terms of timing, which we've run into. Though it's a smaller report, right? It's going to not quite as comprehensive. Jim, I'm going to have to think about your ideas a little bit more, so I don't know if I have anything more to offer there at the moment, but I did like how you were trying to kind of think about. I think some of those connections are already there. We just hadn't described things in those terms, and we certainly hadn't thought about defining the bins differently in Working Group 3 in that way.
Any other responses to the 3 questions we heard? Special report on 1.5, not on 1.5, overshoot and so on, and markers. Kevan, you indicated that you wanted to respond.
Yeah, perhaps on the question that Jim raised about whether there would have been other scenario designs possible that are easier to communicate. I think clearly yes, right? So let's say if we would have had on the table the suggestion to come up with a scenario framework that would basically include climate resilient development pathways, the notion of the shifting development pathway, and the illustrative mitigation and select different illustrative mitigation narratives within those, I think there would have been a way to align them and make choices that are basically more useful across the communities. The timing is the issue, the timing that you brought up as well, right? So if you are 90% of the way already behind you, it's not possible anymore to basically integrate them into something that the community uses in a coherent way. For example, climate resilient low carbon development pathways would be something that already would provide one bridge and would have the shifting pathway in it and the illustrative mitigation pathways as well, right? So I like the idea about a special report which is focusing on overshoot, but I would not focus it on overshoot. I think a special report on perhaps carbon dioxide removal or carbon dioxide removal options might be something very interesting. There was once a special report from the IPCC on carbon capture and storage, which was actually, I thought, which really provided lots of useful insights. CDR was not part of that, and it goes beyond CCS. Yeah.
Okay. Any other responses to the questions we heard? Junior?
Yes, actually, I'd like to come back to Jim's point. So I think that working group 2 SPM table 2 is very useful to linking the all scenarios together. Then certainly temperature categories may be a good way to integrate, but the problem is I think we may have some communication problem for C1, C2, C3 kind of naming. So probably we may need a kind of easy naming for government to better understand. But now I see that there will be better way for us to better integrate, but still we need to think about further. Yes, and then regarding the special report, I think the government should suggest for the special report, right? So if any focal point, no, that is not true. But I think it is a good idea for the overshoot kind of a special report, but before that we may need to clearly define the meaning of overshoot and prioritize which will be the input overshoot scenario we need to assess across working groups. Okay,
and perhaps also fill a gap in the literature, which I think can still be improved. More responses from the audience before we go back and take more questions. We need to also let people...
I'm going to throw a challenge out to everybody, and it was sort of alluded to in the first two talks, and that is, how do we take advantage of the assessed climates in this context where, they're actually pulling together multiple lines of evidence in Working Group 1, but that's not the literature, that's not the climates that are driving Working Group 2, and not what's actually is, in many ways, like the bidding that's going on in Working Group 3. So you have this issue that's sort of, we want to obviously use that's higher value information coming out of Working Group 1. And I just toss it to everybody out there to think about, Alex and Claudia and so on.
Thank you. And then I see a hand there. And Anna, you see the next hand behind from David, and many hands. So please have clear and short questions so we can give the floor to...
So a question maybe we could hear from Ed, I don't know. I really like K1's suggestion of a frequent short cycle assessment process. And so the writing of the Working Group 3 would just be tying the bow on the package. It seems like that's something that Working Group 1 is closer to. So is there any thoughts about specific practices or modalities of doing that could be sort of emulated instead of having to invent something new? Thanks.
Next question, and you can prepare your responses.
One thing that I saw emerge from the three talks, some really actually important conclusions were, and Claudia hit on it too when she came up with her semi-provocative remarks, was the need for leveraging the institutional knowledge that exists in the process into AR7. Definitely that's true. On the other hand, there probably will be some calls, as there always are, for more fresh blood into the process, more first-time authors and so on. So are these things, is there a tension here? Is this incongruent? And I'm wondering, because I see merits to both, obviously.
Thank you. And the next one. I think that's Volker and Alex. Let's take them together since they're so close.
Yeah, I was wondering, the short-term dimension was specifically emphasized. I think that is, in retrospective, a shortcoming of the original SSP RCP framework that basically focuses with climate goals really on the forcing level in 2100, where with the neutrality goals, neutrality and short-term action really has become a much bigger focus. And then in terms of the using SSP, the framework basically for short-term policy assessment, I think the SPAs, which didn't basically take the Paris architecture into account because they were designed previously. I think there's a session on Wednesday to look into that, weren't so useful. There were very few studies that basically combined SSPs in terms of socioeconomic uncertainty with short-term policy assessments. I think that is really, and also highlighted by Kevan's point, a gap that would be useful to fill. So would be eager to hear thoughts in that direction, how to possibly accommodate that. And I mean, there's really a lot of dynamics in that corner.
Thank you, Volker and Alex, and then back to the panel.
So picking up on Kewan's discussion of the impacts models and where they come in, speaking from the agricultural modeling community, we often don't know if we should talk with you before we do our model or present a model that is available and easy and clean for you to pick up. And of course, that gets us potentially in trouble if somebody looks at the model without realizing its intent. There is work on emulators, but I'm bringing this up just to say that impacts community, I think, would like to be closely involved in this process so that we can design the scenarios and ideally get them into your own loop so we can get feedbacks, we can get unintended consequences and systemic effects. Thanks.
Thank you. Anna, did you indicate that we should take one more question? Okay, and I hope you remember the questions now.
So it's come up several times that the integrated assessment modeling community in developing scenarios should abandon the notion that the climate didn't change over the 100 years. And you brought that up, Kewan, as an issue. And I think it's an important development. And it was one of the developments that was foretold or recommended coming out of Nordvikerhout, that this is the direction the scenario development should be proceeding. I do think that we're going to need to have a very ambitious communications program when we do that, because as you pointed out, when we originally made the decision not to include the climate change, it was because we wanted to have a clean point of reference against which the impacts community could take off and actually do the emissions mitigation. Once the emissions mitigation are combined with the climate impacts, then you don't have that clean point of departure any longer, and we're going to have to be really clear, and I think we're going to have parallel tracks that with and without simultaneously, so that we get a literature that's coherent. And we saw the problems just bringing RCPs and SSPs together, where you would have papers that said, I'm going to use the climate from 8.5 and I'm going to use the impacts out of SSP1. Great combo, but is it internally coherent? Maybe not.
Thank you, Ed, and then Jay, and then back to the panel, and then you can respond to the questions about process, mode of working, institutional knowledge, short-term focus, mobile emulators, and what you heard from Jay. So over to the panel.
Sure. Thanks for these questions. Yeah, so I like the idea of moving towards something more like a live database, and it's something that in theory could start soon or immediately. Would or could rely on an institutional memory that at least IASA and Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium has, because they have been running these types of databases for a long time. It wouldn't have to be, but we would definitely be open to that. And I can imagine that people would, writing their papers, developing a scenario, they could upload it to the database. And I can imagine in one case, and this would be similar that happens in other modeling intercomparison projects, is that perhaps scenario, you could flag it as being this one's open and anyone could go in there and download it and see the scenario themselves, or perhaps they're restricted and this would be a smaller subset of users from some kind of committee, or if you didn't want your results quite out there in the open, but open to a wider group of peers who could dig into the data and do some betting. I mean, there are also, or let's say already, I think the possibility that you can have somewhat automated checks and processes that we have in the database that could be extended, that do sanity checks on the data, and then also be extended to, for example, the climate model emulators. So as soon as you upload the scenario, it runs through the different climate model emulators, you see the temperature outcomes, and then also, let's say, climate impact model emulators that could be developed with the working group too. Yeah, I think I'm generally all for this, and I think one important bit which also that Keiwan had emphasized is that particularly within AR6 there was, and this was a big challenge in the end, I tried very hard to expand the focus to national teams and sectoral teams, and many of them, it was their first time. They're very excited to participate. I'm very happy about that. But it was a learning curve in terms of getting the data in the right format and things, and this took time away from other activities. But I think it was an important and valuable outcome in its own sense. And a more open assessment, I think, would facilitate that and get more people on board and feel involved in an IPCC process without necessarily being a lead author. And I think that would be a good thing.
Thank you. More responses to the questions we heard about the development of impact emulators and the involvement of research community there, as flagged by Alex. How can that be done? This was something that was...
Yeah, so I could not agree more that when we do impact emulators, of course, that needs to be together with the impact community. And also your question, Alex, about coming before the agricultural models are basically updated or after. I think in a process like this, we would basically try to collect IM scenarios, but also the impacts information. We need to do that jointly on the table, and that group needs to be, I think, needs to have people from all three working groups. Also, working group 1 should be on that in that group, I think, represented. But there are some impact emulators already out there. So I would find it really interesting if one would do an exercise like Jay, for example, was just mentioning. So we would basically run the integrated assessment models with and without impacts. And then individual sectoral impact modules can be used either for comparing the impacts or for using certain elements of the scenarios without impacts. It could be a very, very rich basis for completely new analysis if you would have both scenarios with and without impacts, and that would allow the integration even further.
Thank you. We also have questions that we got from Zoom. So can you give us the questions? Yeah. Well, there's something I can't hear, Elmar.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me now?
We need...
Can you hear me now?
Well, kind of. Can you speak up? Closer to the microphone.
I'm trying to speak up. So, is it better now?
Yeah, we try.
Oh. All right, sorry for this. So just very quick question on the better integration of impacts or socioeconomic scenarios in the assessment of impacts in working group 2. Is there a difference in perception between the two working groups about the relevance of this? And might there be, this will be related to the fact that a lot of impact studies still use present-day society as a baseline for calculating these impacts, because in Working Group 3 we focus on changing societies to project out the emission scenarios. So my question basically is to Steve and maybe Hans, what can be done in order to make progress in this direction so that scenarios, socioeconomic scenarios, are picked up a bit more by the Working Group 2 assessment?
Thank you. And Brian, do you also have a question?
I do. Hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so one's a comment and one's a suggestion/question. And so the comment is on the ideas that have been brought up about putting impacts into SSPs, reference scenarios, whatever we want to call them. One possibility would be to try to explicitly, formally somehow make something like EasyMIP, for example, an explicit part of the scenario process, right? So we have narratives and drivers, and we have IAM runs, and we should have impact model runs, coordinated model comparison runs for different types of impacts that can be provided with the scenarios. If it's not EasyMIP, then it could be some equivalent organization. IAMs, right, are actually part of EasyMIP, and could be IAMs as well, but there's a larger set of models out there. And there's a couple different talks on this in different parts of the meeting. The second thing is that since, as people have emphasized, there's so much scenario-related work for the assessment to do in advance, and that applies to all the working groups, it might be worth building that in formally into the AR7 cycle by having something, whether it's a workshop or a report or something in advance of the full assessment report on the scenarios, to basically put a marker down to fill that role, to produce that work for this report or workshop for each of the working group needs that have been described. And in particular, since it's been, for whatever reason, so difficult for Working Group 2 to take up scenarios, that maybe this will also help by building it more into the structure of the assessment. It will kind of pave the way for Working Group 2 to be able to do that more effectively next time around.
Thank you, Enma, and thank you, Brian. And then we go to the panel. Would you like to respond to these questions and suggestions? And perhaps Jim, also as a co-chair, would like to add his view on the things that came up. Please, Rebecca.
Yeah, let me take the comment made by Brian. I was going to comment something like that. And in fact, one has raised this issue. Perhaps we have to begin to think about the scenario process as an independent process that should run in parallel to the assessment reports by the IPCC. Some of you may recall, back after the AR5, we had a similar discussion about that. That somehow, we need to have a process in parallel, because as K1 said, in the case of Chapter 3, we are about to end the process, or the time we had to finish our chapter, and we still were waiting for the emulator, the most recent version of the emulator coming for Working Group 1, to be able to finish our chapter and somehow have this information also being used by the different chapters. And that did not work very well. Not because any problem, but simply because it's a long process, lots of activities, and we cannot share the time, of producing a report, and at the same time go through this process of scenario construction, vetting, public calls, and things like that. And also a comment was made before here, any new cycle has, new authors coming into the process, and we cannot risk losing the intelligence or the experience that we have accumulated over time. So one possibility here would be to have this parallel process where you can use the experience of previous authors, those that have been involved in this process, and at the same time have newcomers into the process. But again, I don't think this is something that we could start in a new run for AR7, but we have to start before as a way also to better connect working group 1, 2, and 3, because scenarios perhaps is the easiest way to connect these three working groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other responses to what we heard from the screen, from Elmar and Brian? I think we can go 15 or 20 minutes over 6, since we had some technical problems and started a bit later. So there will be one quick round for some additional questions, and then we end the session. Over to you, Steve.
So I feel obligated because Elmar called me out and Hans isn't here, so I'll try not to speak for Hans, but I'll try to at least speak a little bit for Working Group 2. But I also wanted to respond to some of the other questions that were prior to Elmar's and Brian's. Volker, I just wanted to say that the need for considering socioeconomic uncertainty in the near term, right, I think is critical. And better understanding what those conditions might look like that can be consistent with different climates, right, is going to be part of our really understanding the potential risks, right, and opportunities for adapting in those contexts. So I can't agree with that more. I'll try to just touch base on a few of the other things. Alex, I think emulators, to the extent they're related to impacts, right, we really do need to have, and even on the climate side too, right, we really do need to have the impacts community involved in thinking about what those look like. And I would say that's on the physical responses before you get to sort of the monetization kinds of emulators, which are some of what's being discussed now. That's a totally different beast with a lot of methodological issues. Let's see if I can comment directly on some of these things. One of the things that I find interesting and a little bit of a tension for Working Group 2 is wanting to tell global stories, but recognizing that most of the actual discussion is down at the local level in terms of actual impacts and actual risks and actual response strategies. So the scenarios can be really helpful in constructing the global stories in particular, but then a lot of new issues come in terms of actually getting to characterizing risk at the local level, where you have to get into things that the scenarios can't necessarily provide. So that's something else for us to think about, is how can we provide, if we're trying to, from the FC, provide both pieces of information so we can inform decisions not only at the global level, but also down to in terms of more local decision making. Elmar, you specifically asked about how we might pick up socioeconomic scenarios better, what can be done. I think it's actually being done more often than not now. So you do certainly have examples where assuming a fixed society today, but I think that people know that that's not sort of really the path forward. You need to be bringing in alternative ways of thinking about society. Now the question comes back to what I was raising before: at what scale? Right. So if your questions of risks are more local or regional, and then there's how much do you need the global storyline to be able to construct the regional risk storyline? It can be helpful, but it's not necessarily essential for some of it. And actually, on Wednesday, I'll talk a little bit about uncertainty associated with a single global emissions pathways. It's kind of interesting. And the impacts MIPS, I think, is an interesting idea. I'm not sure how you divide up the impact space to do the MIPS. That's going to be an interesting challenge, right? But certainly it's important. There's huge methodological differences which are creating information that in many cases is incomparable. And so, from an assessment point of view, you're stuck with a lot of different information. You're not even sure if you can even marry it together in terms of figures and other things. So that's a problem. It's certainly a problem in the damage space for estimating monetary damages. We've got methodological differences there that are dramatically different, and they're systematically leading to different estimates. So we've got not even apples and oranges, but like apples and cars, right? I mean, stuff like that we should really think hard about whether we can combine them at all.
Thank you. And then we take 3 quick questions before we end the session. And I saw a hand there, and I saw Gunnar, and I saw Cyril. Yeah. So last row there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is a great discussion. This is Matthew Ginn from IASA. Just in terms of how we as a community sort of come together to develop scenarios that are forward-looking, also in terms of the process timings. One sort of point where I think we really got the Working Group 1, Working Group 3 handshake off the ground in the CMIP process, right? And so I think if we can have some Working Group 2 folks sort of involved at that early stage, that really helped us sort of get the ball rolling, and there were still some procedural things that had to be resolved later on. But I think so. Working group 2 coordination earlier on in the process would be really useful. And then maybe one sort of provocative suggestion is that, I mean, I think that there are going to be scenarios generated for a variety of purposes, but specifically for climate assessment, I think it makes a lot of sense to think about what are the climate regimes that we want to be asking questions about. And so sort of coming at it from actually the climate angle to talk about policy relevant targets. So can we define a series of peak warming, peak timing, and final timing sort of categories, and then investigate what are the scenarios that and ways of mitigating that fit in that space. So two points there.
Thank you. Next one was Gunnar Luder.
Thank you. Gunnar Luder from PIC. I want to follow up on this question of front-loaded vetting of the working group 3 scenarios. I really like that idea. Maybe I should put off my mask. And also feel like a big part of the challenge is that we have these disruptive technological changes, and they are like we have a poor track record of getting that right. So I wonder if we have to be either more, like even more strict in kind of filtering scenarios for the ability to really reproduce what we saw already in the last 10 years in terms of these disruptive changes. Second, shouldn't we also have an element of taking into account stuff that's in the pipeline? For example, the number of electric cars that are being built. We have a good understanding how many hundreds of millions of electric cars will come to the road for the next 5 years, or PV panels, this kind of stuff. And we should make sure that this is adequately represented. And then thirdly, I wonder if we want to have this as a community process, which I think is very, very helpful, don't we need, beyond infrastructure, also like a bit of a formalized framework to make that work and give legitimacy to this?
Thank you. And the last question.
Thank you very much. One of the opportunities that the IPCC had the opportunity to pilot during AR6 is the cross-working group on cities in preparation for AR7. And the urban emission scenarios were also emphasized in the SPM working group 3. Is there a way to structure this into the scenario collection and vetting process also in preparation for AR7? Thank you.
Thank you. And then over to the panel, and then I will say a few. Yeah, and Jim would also like to say something after the panel, and then I will say a few closing words. Yeah, panel, please.
Yeah, and a lot of really very useful additional comments and also questions. I wanted to come back to what Steve, you said about the challenges that information which comes from different parts of the community is sometimes really difficult, uncomparable to a certain extent. And I think exactly for this, because of this purpose, you need these regular updates to define, while you learn, data standards that can be shared across the different communities. I think that's what was happening with parts of the IEM community to make things better comparable. New methodologies had to be developed. Even the database, the scenario results that Jim showed, 90% SSP2 and only 10% other SSPs. Actually, what we did is we tried to find out which of the scenarios look like an SSP2 and which of the scenarios look like an SSP1. Very often they don't say SSP2 or SSP1, but we made them comparable, right? And I think that's why we need this regular vetting process, this collection. Also, it will help us to understand knowledge gaps, what sort of additional scenarios we need at a certain stage. And I really like the suggestion by Brian, and I was wondering whether that's a possibility to think about, if you have this regular update process coming from the community that could feed into a technical report on scenarios shortly before the AR7 and can basically feed into AR7 in a more consolidated way. That could be really interesting.
And the final question about cities. Who would like to respond to that? Perhaps that's something for the co-chair.
There will be a special report on cities, I've heard.
We have that scheduled. So Over to you, Jim.
Yeah. Could I just make a couple of comments, and just to say I'm absolutely behind the idea of a live database in earlier preparation for AR7. So totally behind that. But one of the things we need to think about carefully is what belongs to the research community and what belongs to IPCC. And my view is the database really belongs to the community, but IPCC assesses it, like other pieces of literature. So there might never be an AR7 database. It might be called something different, the community scenario database or whatever, but completely behind that. And then the second thing is, I've had calls for special reports on overshoot and more expert meetings. Can I just flag, the 6th cycle was one of the most hyperactive and overloaded cycles we've ever had. We really suffered from stuff, in this cycle. So I'm very cautious about calls for lots of extra special reports, given that a lot of governments would like to get the next cycle done in time for the second global stocktake in 2028, which really starts to put the pressure on. So one of the casualties of the special reports we had in AR6 was actually expert meetings. They went down compared with previous cycles. And personally, I think it would be far better for IPCC if they were slightly less ambitious about special reports, but did more expert meetings that would help the assessment process onwards. And, scenarios is obviously one topic. You could have a meeting on overshoot, as a way of doing it. And we should use maybe meeting reports or workshop reports as a way of advancing the agenda, rather than having more elaborate processes that need to get plenary approval from governments.
Thank you, Jim, for these useful reflections. So I think we have to close the session now. So Claudia pointed to the issue of timing, and I think we've heard several reflections on better preparations and better planning for AR7. We still need to finalize AR6 before we can start finalizing that, and there will be a synthesis report next year, which has been delayed. So we focus on that, but then we will start working on AR7. Claudia also asked for considerations about more top-down steering or what is needed from the bottom-up level. And I think we've heard reflections on both approaches here. I definitely think the research community can help us to do this better next time. But IPCC also needs to think, what do we want and how do we want to do this next time? We heard many of the presenters, they thought we had made great achievements or progress in AR6 compared to previous cycles. But there's so much still we can do better. And I think we've learned what we can do better. And also today we heard more specifically where we can improve our collaboration. I hear people want more coordination across the working groups within IPCC and across the communities outside. And as Jim pointed to, we need to be conscious of the split between IPCC activities and responsibilities and what is done in the scientific community. So I hope that's something that we can discuss further. And perhaps we need more formalization of the cross-collaboration. A lot of the cross-working group efforts were done by people who were very inspired to do something extra and worked very, very hard to make these links between the working groups contribute to the integration. So thanks a lot to all those who worked so hard for this. Something that we didn't touch today is the communication aspects of scenarios. And we saw that after Working Group 1, how difficult it was to explain what Working Group 1 had done and what we had not done. We didn't say what is needed, we just assumed some emission pathways and studied the physical outcomes. So this will be treated in a webinar after the summer, and Catherine is working on that. So today we heard a lot of questions. We didn't reach all the answers, but we have a lot of questions to consider further for the workshop. And please also share your reflections on these questions in commentaries, papers, and let's do some thinking together in the community, outside IPCC and inside IPCC. And please fill the gaps that you see in the scenario literature, so we have more literature to digest next time, even if we see that the number of papers are increasing steeply. So let me also remind you that this session has one poster by Ed Byers that that you can enjoy later tonight. And also there is a web page for the session where you can write some comments about what we've heard in this session. So with that, thank you very much for your presentations and for the discussion.